Our Father in heaven, we give you thanks for this beautiful day you have made. We give you thanks that you have called us to keep this day holy, that you set it apart by your example and your teaching, that you have made it holy, that you, a God without fatigue or worry, should rest, and that we who are made in your image should likewise rest. And we thank you for this precious day in which we have enjoyed the rest that comes when we worship you, the rest that comes when we fellowship with one another, the rest that comes when we push away the worries and the cares and the work, when we instead focus on you and all the good that you have done us and delight in you. And so, Father, we ask once more this night you would give us rest. And that as we study these things and think about its importance for our relationships, you would give to us a spirit of discernment and of wisdom, a clarity of thought, a strength of heart and of will, that we might know you, that we might delight in your purposes, that we might fulfill your word and obey your law. Our Father, give to us tonight humble and attentive hearts, that we might delight in the good things you have for us, and that we might rejoice in your great glory. For these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are on lecture 9, which is the fourth commandment, rest. But to provide a little context, we're actually sort of in this transition here. I want to go over, this little break, this little hiatus, sort of where we've come and where I've been going. We had 2 intro lectures that have focused on sort of relationships in general. I don't know that I want to do it that way. Relationships, and then specifically human relationships. And the point that I was trying to drive at in those lectures is that we have all these relationships, and they do not occur in a vacuum. HR being human relationships, not human relations. Right? Okay. And they all occur in this situation that we call creation. And they all occur underneath the oversight and direction of God. And so when we approach our relationships, we need to recognize the triangulation that goes on. There isn't a relationship we're in that doesn't somehow impact our other human relationships. To be in a marriage, to be in a friendship, to be in a membership in a church is necessarily going to shape and impact our other relationships. Likewise, we're in a creation. We're bodied creatures. And so our relationships are necessarily going to be impacted by the creation, as well as it's going to impact the creation. An example of that just this morning, I just thought of, I forget who we were talking to, but it's spring, right? So what happens in New England relationships in the spring? We all start smiling at each other more. We start joking with each other more because the daylight is getting longer and our skin is warming up and, it's great. We're exercising again. But also then the relationships all occur under the oversight of God. And we need to take into account that whether we're believers or not, the presence and existence of God is necessarily impacting those relationships, and vice versa. Our understanding of God is being impacted by our relationships. As a brief example of that, you've heard of the struggles of someone who's had an abusive father to connect with this prayer, Our Father in Heaven. That human relationship has necessarily damaged our understanding of God as Father. But then we proceeded into sort of, it's still part of the intro, I don't know what to call it, but the next part. And we covered under the next part 3 things about love. Specifically, its definition, its description, I can talk much faster than I can write, description, and its ambition. And in this way, these 3 lectures were intended to develop the idea of love as being sort of the engine or energy for relationships. What causes human beings to want to move toward each other? Ultimately, the purest and most constructive and beneficial motive is going to be love. Other motives that cause us to draw near to others is going to corrupt the relationship. But love is that superlative motive and condition that causes us to embrace the relationship in a self-sacrificing way, in a self-denying way. That love's desire or ambition is to see the others in the relationship thrive and grow. And then we move to, I don't know what to call it again. Let's see, the first 3 commandments. So the start into the commandments. But as we started into the commandments, there was sort of a foundation layer within the commandments, the first 3 commandments, in which we say we must have God first, we must worship Him, and then thirdly, we must have God's name. And in this way, these 3 lay something of a foundation for human relationships. That for a human relationship to do well, to thrive, God must be at the pinnacle of it. He must be at the center of it. He must be the one supreme power in the relationship. Without God in the relationship will devolve or can devolve into a power struggle between the 2 self-deifying parties. Or it can devolve into idolatry, where one is deifying the other. But God adds to it His glory and His grace to shape the relationship. Secondly, we keep God at the center by worshiping Him, by sort of exiting, as it were, that relationship and entering into the heavenly discipline and experience of exalting God and humbling self. By engaging in a regular rhythm, at least weekly with the church, of worship, we bring our relationships into focus. And the worship of God is intended to provide perspective to relationships that can seem to dominate or haunt our lives, where we begin to think of problems as inescapable and intractable. But instead, we come to the worship of God, and we see how small we are, and we see how great and glorious He is, and we begin to see the relationship and all of its problems in proper perspective. It gives a little vantage point to it. Thirdly, we have God's name, that there are spiritual disciplines by which we exercise in our lives the integrity of knowing who we really are, of actually impressing into our lifestyle an identity, which is God's name. That He has placed His name upon us, which is a mark of claim and ownership. We are no longer the sons of Adam or the daughters of Eve. Sorry, C.S. Lewis, that was pretty cool. But we are in fact the sons and daughters of God. And it is His name that is upon us. And so we keep that name holy primarily in our lifestyle, in developing a lifestyle of discipline in which we bring out the consistency of His name. So where we're going to now is what I've been calling sort of the intermission or the transition, something like that, in which we're going to look at commandments, the 4th commandment really, in which we need rest. And this really ought to be a 1 and a 2 again. 1, 2. And we'll look at community as a framework for the final commandments. Then we'll return to the commandments and we'll look at 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and how they work into our relationships. So right now we're kind of entering into this intermission period where I want to look at the 4th commandment, and you'll see why I treat that as an intermission, as something in between. But then we'll look at community next time as well. Any questions on that material that is obviously not my lecture, but I thought worth 10 minutes of my lecture time? That, and I could do it with minimal preparation. Okay, so there's a little bit of better sense of what track we're on, where that track's been going and where it's headed. Okay. Then getting actually to our lecture tonight. looking at the idea of rest and what it means for our relationships. First, to set the stage a little bit, one Sabbath evening long ago, we were in a church that had Sabbath evening worship, and my toddler daughter came toddling into the room as we were getting ready to leave to head over to the church, and she was carrying her big white stuffed bunny. I said, "Oh, honey, you got to take the bunny back and put it down. We're going to go over and we're going to worship Jesus." She rolled her eyes and she sighed and said, "Daddy, bunnies need to worship Jesus too." So the big white stuffed bunny came to church that night and worshiped Jesus with us. There is a universality to worship, not just to bunnies. In fact, arguably they don't worship. They glorify God in everything they do in fulfilling his decrees. But, bending the will, they don't have a will. But for humans, there is a universality to worship. There's a sense in which we approach each of our relationships with this sense, look, friend, you need to worship Jesus too. Neighbor, you need to worship Jesus too. Husband, bride, child, parent, you need to worship Jesus too. But within that also is the need to recognize rest. That worship is a particular act of rest. It is a particular discipline that drives us away from the work and the world and sends us heavenward to rest upon what God has done and not upon our performance. Just as worship is universally necessary for human relationships, rest is universally necessary for human relationships. God is not a tyrant. In fact, he is not like any other God. That when he brings his people up out of Egypt, which if you'll remember from the story, was a time in which you have the people of God beneath the heel of Pharaoh. And if you go through it, Walter Brueggemann has a book, Sabbath as Resistance. And he has this whole page where he lists out the quotes of Pharaoh directed to Israel. And do you know what verb appears in every sentence that man speaks? Work, make, do. Pharaoh and most employers, most human gods, most false gods approach their creatures, their employees with this mentality. That you exist to work, you exist to produce, you exist to serve. But God brings his people up out of Egypt. He crosses the Red Sea. He carries them on wings, as it were, into the wilderness and sets them down before Mount Sinai. And the fourth thing he says to them is, now that I've got you, here's what I want from you. Go and rest. Rest. It's actually a command. There's this great line in Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall lack nothing, to quote from one of the other Psalm 23 versions that we don't sing so often. He provides everything I need, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. Did you ever notice the verb, how strong it is? He makes me lie down. He's the shepherd who walks along with the crook of his cane, smacks our legs until we go flopping into the grass, and then he says, stay there till Monday morning. He makes us lie down. He commands rest. He says, you need to be a people who don't think, I got to work all the time. I got to achieve constantly. Rest is what he commands. He is not a tyrant. He is a loving and good God. He wants us to rest so that we might know our dependency on him. So to begin with tonight, let's look at what the commandment actually lays out for us. First, within the commandment, we see that there is actually a positive statement. Do all your work in 6 days. There is a command to be busy. There is a command to be productive, but to have a limit on it. To be busy and productive for 6 days. I think I've told this story before. I remember working early on the farm with my father, and we would get up at, before the sun did, and we would work all morning, and we'd go home and have a giant breakfast. We'd go back out, and we'd start working again, and we'd work till lunch, and sometimes we ate lunch on the tractor, and we just kept going and kept going. And then one day I was out, feeding the calves, and Dad came into the barn and said, "Let's go home." I said, "Dad, I'm not done." And he said, "They'll be there tomorrow. Day's over. Go home." There is a limit. We work hard, we work long, we work 6 days, but then we stop. Now, why 6 days?
Because the 7th is a Sabbath day.
The 7th day is a Sabbath day. Yeah. Does anyone know how we got that distinction? Yeah.
God made it by resting on the 7th day.
Yeah, now the Bailey kids have been through a little bit of this already. So, does God get tired?
No.
So why does God rest?
We get tired.
So that we'll rest. Let's back up a minute. Why does God create in 6 days? How long does God actually need to create the whole universe? About that long. I mean, he could have said, "Let it be," and not filled in the direct object, and it would have all been. God doesn't need 6 days. As the scholars have often pointed out, it's not a marvel that he created everything in so short a span. It's a marvel that he took so long. But 6 days was to set the pattern. He intentionally spaced out his work of creation to set the scale and the pattern for humans, that we work over 6 days, but then we cease and desist on the 7th. We bring an end. Yeah, I totally thought of that. We struggle. You were there. The deacons and elders struggled with the word cease and desist for a little while in a recent meeting. So we're getting better. We're learning.
You can say it was me, so they don't think it was ever right.
On the 7th day, we cease from our labors. We've worked hard for 6 days, but then we put an end to it. And we do this because God has done it. He sets the pattern. And we look at that, and as humans, we may say in our pride and our arrogance, "I don't need that." Even if we were to so arrogantly say, "I don't need that day of rest," okay, it's just not true. It's an arrogant presumption. But even if we were to grant it, we would still have an answer. That's what God did, and he didn't need it. There is a requirement to enter into rest, a rest that God is already performing, that we should go and join him in his rest. But likewise, within the commandment, there is an expectation that we would liberate others on this day as well. This is a day of freedom, a day to be free from worry and care and stress, particularly for your household. Do you notice that both in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, there is a list? It is the longest commandment simply because it bothers to list. Neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your livestock, nor the sojourner who is within your gates. In Exodus 20. I haven't memorized Deuteronomy 5. And you have this list. Meaning everybody. If there is someone you employ, if there is someone over whom you have authority, the 4th commandment says, set them free. Once every 7 days, you release them from the obligations and responsibilities they otherwise owe you. This is the goal of the Exodus, that God says, 6 days you shall labor, the seventh day you shall rest. Now we see this exact pattern in the life of Jesus Christ. If you examine all the Sabbath day narratives of Jesus, what do you find him doing? Healing, casting out demons, feeding the hungry. He is setting others free. It is a day, he says to the Pharisees, to do good. A day to give freedom and rest to others. It's not only a day to consume rest for ourselves, it is also a day to give rest to others, to share mutually in our freedom and in our rest. In this way, the commandment is a transition. It is not only a call to come rest with God, it is also a command to come rest with one another. It is both the vertical commandment, like commandments 1 through 3, concerning God. It is also a horizontal commandment concerning others. And this is where I want to begin to make our transition that I'll do in a moment, where we've been seeing how a healthy relationship with God, commandments 1, 2, 3, and 4, is the essential prerequisite for a healthy relationship with one another. As John Calvin put it in his Institutes, we do not truly know ourselves until we know God. We must know him, for we are made in his image. In this way, the commandments essentially frame for us the prerequisites of healthy relationships, a knowledge and experience of God. The commandment here does the same, that we follow in God's footsteps. We enter into the rest he is already enjoying. And when we join him in rest, there is a profound impact on others that I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. But is there any questions about the commandment itself? Yes?
Would you say part of the resting is delighting as well? It's not explicit, I don't think, in Exodus 20 or Deuteronomy 5, but you mentioned God doesn't have to rest. You could say, some Sundays we may not feel a need to physically rest, but it seems like part of...
I haven't seen that Sunday in a long time, but yeah. No, I agree. I hear you.
It's not a purely physical argument. I think part of it, why we rest from everything is to delight in what God's done. And I was just looking up in Genesis, I haven't gotten there yet, but is there something in Genesis that says part of his resting is delighting in the goodness of creation?
Yeah, so it's not. I don't know that it's expressly stated in Genesis as such, but yes, there is this understanding that Jesus is teaching that God has been working since the creation of the world, though he is in his seventh day of rest. And what Jesus is illustrating for us there is that principle of God's rest isn't idleness. It's upholding all of human history. God's act of rest in the seventh day is basically the last 10,000 years of human history, or how many other 1,000 years you think it is. But the number isn't important. The important idea is that God has been resting in his providential governing of all of human history. And it's his delight in his work of creation that is the distinction. The passage I would actually turn to, Tim, is Isaiah 58. If you turn your foot from your own way and call my Sabbath a delight. That there's an intention on God's part that we would understand it as the day that he throws heaven wide and says, come and feast at my table, come and join my family, come and play with all my toys, come and run up and down the halls of heaven. And we sit there and go, I don't know, I'm tired today. And he's like, too tired to party in heaven? Like, I don't understand that kind of tired. You know, that there is a sense in which the Sabbath day is a call to a delight in God, a call to suspend exhaustion and to fall hard into the hands of God and to just rest upon him and to delight in him. So Westminster has very famously, it's become a point of contention within some Reformed circles, said that the whole day is to be spent in the public and private worship of God. I got up at 5:30. Is it been, somebody do the math, 13 hours? Is that right? Of nonstop public and private worship. Now, if you take that as the formal, regulated worship, no. How far did I go this morning? 75 minutes? 80 minutes? But if it means the delighting in God according to Isaiah 58, of actually consciously thinking of Him and being aware of Him and enjoying the good things He's given us and consciously thinking, I'm not here today to celebrate food, but the food God has given me. I'm not here to celebrate friends, but the friends God has given me. To deliberately for 24 hours connect all that I'm experiencing to the gifts and goodness of God, that I draw back into the delighting in God and nurture that joy in Jesus. Yes, Tom.
The statements of the commandment both talk about remembering and making the Sabbath is holy. I think both of those point to remembering God, not just to abstraction, but they both point us to human relationship, resting in Him.
Right. Yeah, we remember the Sabbath. We keep it holy. Both of these presuppose that whatever needed to be done for the Sabbath day has already been done. It is holy. We keep it that way. It is delightful. We remember that it's delightful. Yeah, we work it into our lives that this is a season of delighting in God together. Yes, Chris.
Picking up on what the people have said about delight, I was struck with this in Isaiah 58. We call the Sabbath of delight, and if you keep it the holy day of the Lord honorable, it says, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord.
Very good, Chris. So right there in Isaiah 58, if you delight in the Sabbath, you are delighting in the Lord. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Okay? So that's the commandment. Now to look at some of its impact on our human relationships, let's do the inverse. Let's flip it around a little. First, economics and ecology. When we remove rest from our economic system, we reduce it to supply and demand. And this often happens in the American experience. We understand the relationship between human beings to be primarily one of production and consumption. That we exist to make things and we exist to use things. And our human relationships begin to take on that dynamic. What are you producing for me in this friendship? What can I consume in this marriage? And we begin bringing our relationships down to dollar signs and to this supply and demand sort of mentality. What we are often missing in this approach is that there is a third component to all human economics and relationships: rest. This becomes critically important when we consider the universality and the equality that rest introduces into the system. If our human relationships are simply reduced to what I can give or what I can get, then the human relationship becomes stilted and awkward. It loses that force of love. But by contrast, when I recognize that I cannot produce as equally as some of you, and that I cannot consume as equally as some of you, but gee, we all can rest. For it is a withdrawal from production and consumption. For it is a distancing ourselves from the operation of the world and the vibrations of our labors. There becomes an equalizing impact on our relationships. That when I recognize that I may not be able to produce everything you need, and that I cannot possibly expect you to produce everything I need, but rather once a week we have it embedded in our relationship that we will depart from that mentality entirely and simply rest, and simply set down our tools, and simply sit in our chairs and enjoy each other's presence, or the presence of our God in particular, that we will delight in Him together, our relationship takes another shade and another shape. That we exist together as enjoyers of the goodness of God, and that there is, in fact, again, within this relationship, a third party, God Himself. And He is the maker of the relationship, the sustainer and perfecter of the relationship. And we give up our weapons, we give up our tools, we lay down the fight, we lay down the work, and one day a week, we are simply vulnerable, weak, needy, and looking to God. And saying we are all at the same point here in time. This is something that is profoundly shaped and displayed in Acts chapter 2. When it refers to the fellowship of the saints in Acts 2:42, it's referring to the Sabbath day rhythm, where once a week, everyone who would show up with a surplus of food or clothing would hunt down those who had a deficit and redistribute by will, to be sure that there was rest once a week. That there was one day each week where there were no needs in the congregation. No one went hungry on the Sabbath, no one was lonely, no one was naked. Because the fellowship saw that this was not a time to produce or consume, but to share. But to share in what God had done and what God had given. Secondly, likewise, there is salvation itself. Can someone tell me what is saving faith? Saving faith is a gift of God's free grace in which we... Nope. That's repentance. That's a good one, though. Rest. Receive and rest upon Christ alone as He is freely offered to us in the gospel. Salvation ultimately is itself an act of rest, by which we depart from our works righteousness, our hard labors of producing and consuming. If only I can generate enough goodness. If only I can stop consuming enough evil. If only I can bring balance to the force, then I will be saved. But that's not what we teach or preach in the gospel. Rather, the Sabbath becomes a weekly expression of our gospel and of our doctrine. That the Sabbath is our visible physical demonstration. I do not labor for God's favor. I rest in the works and righteousness of Jesus Christ. In my salvation, my saving faith, I am receiving Christ and resting upon Him alone. I am practicing Sabbath in my faith, trusting Him and seeing myself as dependent. Calvin observed with John, that's a New England, with Adam, John Adams, with Adam, that the original aim of God in the garden was to communicate to Adam and all his descendants a sense of dependence. That we need God, that we must rest upon God. And Sabbath is that intrusion into the work and into the world to say, be at peace, be still. You need God and you have God. So you have all you need. But then thirdly, there is Jubilee. The Sabbath principle grows throughout the Mosaic law, particularly in this component of liberation. For in the Mosaic economy, if practiced correctly, the Sabbath would come not only every seventh day, but every seventh year. And every seventh year. And the odds, the rate, the scale by which the Sabbath was practiced escalated exponentially. So for instance, in the 49th and 50th year, what happened to the land? It rested. Now, if you think that this rest principle is sort of a small one, that God is not terribly concerned that every seventh day we rest, or every seventh year the land rests, or that every 49th year the entire human civilization rests and entirely reverts to its original inheritance structure, what was God's own statement for the exile and how long it would last?
Long enough to make up for the Sabbath usually.
The land will lie fallow for every year it didn't when you were in it. He takes the Sabbath principle so seriously that when his people, for 400 years, give the land no rest, he literally throws them out of the land to give it its rest. God insists that the creation rests. Who's in the list in the commandments? Your sons, your daughters, your male servants, your female servants, your livestock, your ox and your donkey. In our case, our cars. No, I'm kidding. Those things that we influence, those things that are in the created order, ought to have rest. One of the books I read on this topic mentioned that, they have this mini farm, as it were, and the animals know when it's Saturday night because the food is twice as much as any other night. It's kind of a silly little practice, but on the other hand, it reinforces this principle. They are giving rest, a feast to their animals to enjoy the following day. It also allows them to not feed the animals throughout the day, but it's this sense of celebration for the creation, for ourselves, that we practice the liberty and the equality that comes, even the fraternity, although the French misused all that. It brings it about in a manner that is uniting to humanity, that is community creating. There's a marvelous thing that we experience without a language for it in Reformed and Presbyterian circles or any Sabbatarian circles. But if you go and read the rabbis, the Jews understand this. The Jews have an economy for what they can lose. And they will give up the Torah before they give up the Sabbath. That's actually listed out in the rabbi's instruction. They point back to the 1940s. And one of the biggest things the Nazis tried to do in concentration camps was break Sabbath keeping. Because the Nazis recognized the community that keeps Sabbath is an unbreakable bonded community. It so thoroughly reinforces our identity. It so encaptures a self-embrace of our true identity. That's Walter Brueggemann. He calls it a school for our desires, where the Sabbath disciplines our hearts to not long for work too much, to not long for stuff, for food, for possessions, for clothing, for fame, for fortune, for another rung on the corporate ladder. The Sabbath comes in and says in this grand and glorious voice, no. No more work, no more prestige, no more fame, no more fortune, no more climbing. No, I have enough. And enough is as good as a feast, as the old saying goes, at least for Mary Poppins. There is in Jubilee a freedom, that we have a God who is generous and life-giving. And I'm way off my notes, and that went, okay. I'm going to stop there because that got really exciting, and I didn't know what I was talking about. Any questions on what a missing Sabbath does to human relationships? Yes, Jake.
I don't want to get ahead of the game. Are we going to talk about a misused Sabbath and how it impacts human relationships?
Misused Sabbath and how it impacts human
We're
relationships.
talking about the celebrating Sabbath together versus not, and what that does. it seems to me as if it would be reasonable to discuss a misuse of the Sabbath and how that impacts the community.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I've been comparing having a Sabbath versus not having a Sabbath.
Right.
Right. That's a great question. Yeah, let's dig into that. So do you have specifics you want to throw at me, or do you want me to just run with it?
Run with it. Let's
Okay. What could go wrong? Yeah, examples of like misusing the Sabbath. I had alluded to somebody that I wanted to go here tonight, so I'll totally use your question to go here. Husbands, if your wife is cooking all day on the Sabbath, she's not resting. It's a misuse of the day. And that doesn't mean that husbands jump into the kitchen and suddenly burn the dinner because they don't know how to cook. It means they contribute to the week. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. Help your wife. Work with her so that the work is done Saturday night and not left over into Sunday. Don't abandon her Monday through Saturday so that she's scrambling on Sabbath to get stuff in order. So yeah, misusing the Sabbath day. There's a tight one right there. Misusing the Sabbath. Yeah.
This sort of kind of picks up on that, which is, I think others have observed that the Westminster Standards don't really give much emphasis to the fact that the way the Fourth Commandment is written, it really seems to, it addresses everyone, but it particularly addresses people with the ability to keep other people from resting.
Yes.
Don't let your maidservant not rest. Don't let your manservant, your ox, it's like that doesn't apply to people who don't have power over somebody else.
The commandment is oriented, that's very good insight, to those in authority. Pastors, don't construct your church's ministries to be Sabbath oriented. On the Lord's Day, we're going to go out and do all these things. It's like, no, this is a day to rest. And so those in authority need to think about that, yeah. Parents with children, how do we construct a day in which our children rest? And going back to Isaiah 58, learn to delight in this kind of rest. There's got to be, from the parents, some sort of enthusiasm and some sort of engagement with the children that says, I love doing this. And come, learn to love it with me. That we practice within these relationships a delight in drawing near to God and drawing away from the world and delighting in the things of God. Obviously, employers, right? Close the shop, Don't bring the workers in. One of the things that we need to understand, I'll put this in there and hope I don't lose my train of thought. Works of necessity and mercy, yes. Being accepted. Doctors and nurses have to take care of sick people on Sunday. You have to deliver babies on Sunday. For some reason, they don't take Sundays off. And so, yes, there are responsibilities that must be carried out on the Lord's Day. Yes. But within the framework of what is not a work of necessity or mercy, there is a responsibility to provide rest and to use our authority as cover for helping one another rest and saying to each other, how can I help make sure you're able to rest? I'll give you another example. There's people who have to travel to get here. We're a regional church. And some of them have to put in time and energy and money, and some of them don't have cars. And we at least have one situation in our congregation where one member of our church is giving rest to another member of the church by saying, I will drive you. Don't take the T or Uber. Come and enjoy fellowship with me in my car. It's fine. We can do that. To think deliberately about one another in the fellowship of the church and say, what are your barriers to enjoying a day of rest? And how can I free you from them? What can I contribute Monday through Saturday, that brings about a rest on the Sabbath day? Does that help a little? I could go a lot longer. Really could. Great question. Chris.
think it's good to reflect that it's not just, it is taught in Scripture, of course, but it's built into the fabric of creation.
Mhm.
And you saw that with the very thorough attempt the French Revolution made to switch us from a 7-day week to a 10-day. They didn't even call it a week at that point. And they found it impossible to do. They worked at it very carefully and thoroughly. And they gave special names to the different 10 units.
Mhm.
Units, but they couldn't make it go. And that's not just because they didn't try. It's built into the fabric of creation. 6 days, God worked 6 days, so
We work 6 days and rest one. Yeah, it's the reason I thought earlier tonight and used the words, equality, fraternity, and liberty, is there is this irony that the French Revolution, under that banner, tried to banish the Sabbath day, when it's that day that brings liberty to the people of God. It's that day that brings a sense of equality, that we put aside our incomes. You have James where it says, don't come to church looking like the rich or the poor. Come to the church looking like the people of God in need of his grace. Be adorned with righteousness. The book of Hebrews makes the same point, that there is on the Sabbath day a practiced equality and community. Okay? All right, then the last portion that I want to look at tonight, number C, letter C, some concepts of application. Not that we've been avoiding that, but one, I want us to think about intentionality. As one book I read, A.J. Swoboda, Subversive Sabbath, said, nobody accidentally keeps the Sabbath day holy. Nobody stumbles into the Sabbath and it's just like, yeah, this is pretty cool. That's not part of the human framework. There needs to be intentionality, that God deliberately chose to limit what he will do. And so we must be like him. One of the chief instruments for bringing about a Sabbath rest on the seventh day is saying no in the other 6. There is a need to recognize ourselves as creatures and limit ourselves. God limited himself to 6 days, even though he is without limit. So we, how much more, having limits to energy and attention, need to say no and need to recognize we are not the God the world is looking for, nor our friends, nor our family members. Our relationships need the word no. If you look into the child psychology about parenting, what's the single most important word for a child? They hate it, but they need it. No. It's a critically important word. It's a word we need in our friendships. It's a word that I as a pastor need to cultivate. It's the word that comes up often in our session meetings when we stare at each other and go, wow, we really struggle with this word. There is a balance that we must humble ourselves and say we are not the elders who can save everyone and solve everything. We need a humility in our ministry and our service, an intentionality that says, I too need rest. And I too am insufficient for the tasks. I too need a Jesus who actually covers for me. There's an intentionality, but also then, as I've been hitting the idea, there needs to be an equality. There needs to be an equality to our rest, that we create within our systems an understanding that some will produce more, some will consume more, but buried at the bottom of the Sabbath principle is this idea: it's all God's. None of it's mine. Why does God, throughout the Mosaic law, say on the year of Jubilee, all the land goes back to the way it was originally? Because then he adds the phrase, for it is all mine. Why does he say on the seventh day you should rest? Because all your productivity is mine. because all your work is mine, because he is the Lord, and all the earth and the fullness therein is his. Psalm 24. Because he owns everything and we own nothing. So there are times when we must practice a deference to our dependence on him, in which we must weekly remind ourselves in a tangible expression, he owns it all. And so we share it freely and we all alike rest. It's the one thing we can do. Like we talked about in the worship conversation, one thing that I really like about a cappella singing, it's the one instrument we all play, the heart, the human heart. Likewise, rest is the one economic contribution we can all make. There is no human who cannot rest. It is a great equalizing for us. But also then hospitality. There is something about the sharedness of the Sabbath day that is so important. I don't want to hit on this too hard in the sense that y'all seem to be doing this one a lot. So good job. But here's some of the theology that ties into it. Isaiah 56, there is in verses 3 through 5 a remarkable expression to the people of God. He first says, "Let the foreigners keep my Sabbath." He then says, "And I will bless the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath." Foreigners and eunuchs. What do those two groups have in common? They couldn't, I heard something in there. They couldn't enter the tabernacle or temple.
They're not with their people, or they don't have other people.
Yeah, they're without family. They're without future in the people of God. They are the fringe. They are the isolated, the lonely. They are the ones who don't see generations to come the church coming from them. They are the ones who can't come into the tabernacle. They are the ones who can't go up to the temple, who cannot worship God. And yet in Isaiah 56, what does he say? Keep the Sabbath. Yet they are called to rest. And yet they are called to enjoy the rest of God's people as if they were part of God's people. There is a welcome of strangers and foreigners that is an essential expression of rest in the people of God. That God has welcomed us into his heavenly house, and we have no biblical grounds to exclude anyone else who comes seeking rest. If you notice when we sing Psalm 84, selection B, there's that weird mention of the sparrow. And it's like, the song about the sparrow. Why are we singing about a sparrow? Well, what's the line? The sparrow finds rest in your house. Even a sparrow, even the most inconsequential, ugly, forgettable bird in the world, I don't know if that's true or not, but finds rest in God's house. God's welcome is so complete, so thorough, that he brings even sparrows into his house and gives them rest. How much more you and me? How much more strangers? How much more foreigners? How much more those living on the fringe of society? This is a day for rest, for peace. The last is time. There's something very important about time. It's a point that I don't feel I have to belabor here in New England, especially in Boston. We have nothing more valuable than our time. It's the one thing we spend that is never replenished. I can give you money and next week I'll get more. I can give you food, I can give you clothing, I can give you shelter, and it does not exhaust my supply. But let me tell you, as every one of you super busy Bostonians feel as well, 10 minutes is a lot of time. There are two myths regarding time that the Sabbath destroys for us. One is the myth of multitasking. Some of you are laughing because I've talked about this before. You've already heard my diatribe. It is a myth. The Sabbath comes in and says, you cannot work and rest. You cannot play with the things of God and the things of this world. If you are going to ascend into the heavens for a whole day and feast at your Father's table and delight in your Father's family, then you're going to do that, and you can't mix it with the earthly. There is no multitasking possible. But rather, we must step away in order to enjoy. We must, in this sense, despise efficiency on the Lord's Day and ignore the clock. That doesn't mean I'll preach for 90 minutes next Lord's Day. I won't even be here. It'll be Matt Owens. But it doesn't mean I won't preach for 90 minutes the Lord's Day either. But there should be this freedom from the watch and from the clock. There should be this embrace that there is, my second point, a myth between quantity time and quality time. Quality time is necessarily quantity time. Have you ever gotten into that deep conversation where all of a sudden you're sharing things with one another and you're bearing your souls? And have any of you actually dared to look at the clock and to see how long it takes you? Some of us really obnoxious people who teach on this have actually done that. It consistently takes me 90 to 120 minutes to get you guys to really bond and connect with me. An hour and a half to 2 hours. That's how long a good human conversation takes to really get going. The deep stuff, the open stuff. And you sit there and, believe me, if your calendar looks like mine, you go, I don't have 2 hours. And then the Lord holds up the Sabbath day and says, oh no? What's this day for? This is the day where time doesn't matter, where the clock goes away, where we invest in one another and we say, tomorrow will come and I'll deal with it then. But for today, I enjoy the goodness of God. A.J. Swoboda writes, friends do not enter into time together for the purposes of productivity or to get anything out of it. Friends simply love to be with one another. And this is what God calls us, friends. He wants us to be with him. Walter Brueggemann again, Sabbath is a restraint, a withdrawal, a divestment from the concrete practices of a society that specializes in anxiety. We live in an anxious age, Joseph Bodum, and we on our Sabbath day resist and subvert all the ambitions of a human civilization built on self-righteousness and pride, and instead embrace the goodness of God and rest in him. I'll actually end with the fine man himself, St. Augustine. Our hearts are restless. Can you finish it? Till they find their rest in you. Our hearts are restless till they find their rest in you. So let us rest. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Chris.
Practically speaking, I think it is getting harder to keep Sabbath fully because of the pressure. The current generation of Americans have less understanding in a cultural sense, and I think we should anticipate that it's not going to be easy. I think one thing that has helped me over the years is just making, when we're talking with supervisors and about work, especially when starting a job, to be candid with them about that kind of work that day. And even though they may not fully understand it, they do recognize, the person that was there. And I think that one way not to go is to just say nothing and then hope that it'll be okay. Because at that point, they may say, well, why did you not tell me this before? And I think practically speaking, just be upfront, and I think that makes work.
Yeah, there's only a few things God himself calls a sign of the covenant. One circumcision, the other's the Sabbath. It's referred to as an identifying particularity. It is a standout feature of the church, of the people of God. One right-at-home illustration. Just this last week, I had the umpteenth time a neighbor on Antrim Street comment on the parade of Baileys that comes down the street every Sunday morning. It's an inescapable feature. There are 6 well-dressed Baileys, 8 well-dressed Baileys, trundling down the street every Sabbath morning. Like they can't escape it. It's right there in the middle of the street. It's a hallmark of the Christian faith. Anything else? Yes, Kyle.
I've always struggled with Colossians 2, where it says, "Don't judge another man's food or drink," and then it lists the Sabbath as one of those things. Is that the same Sabbath that's being talked of there? I don't know the history of what Paul's talking about there. People will point to that as like, hey, stay on my life. Don't talk to me about Sabbath. Wondering what you were talking about.
Yeah, the quick answer that would probably need more development, but I'll try anyway, is you have the Sabbath that is ceremonial in the Mosaic law and the unique practices. Pick up sticks and you die. You know, that kind of thing. But then there's the Sabbath that is moral, embedded in the 4th commandment. 1 day in 7 is to be set apart for delighting in the Lord your God. So this is the core of the commandment. This is the unique cultural expressions or judicial applications of it. And Paul, I think in Colossians chapter 2, is referring us to the Sabbath day as a ceremonial phenomenon of the Mosaic covenant.
Is it in the plural?
Okay, yeah. I was trying to think, it's mentioned more than once there. If both references are plural, is that? Okay.
It also says new moons.
And new moons, right, which would connect it, which would point us to this ceremonial sense of the Sabbath. So the new moons, the Sabbaths, plural, the idea being the festivals of Leviticus 23, and that it's the unique ceremonial Sabbath that is the unique cultural and legal development of the moral principle, that in the new covenant it's reduced to this, to the moral core. So that would be my handling of that text. Real quick and dirty, sorry. There's a lot there to flush out. Yes?
You talk about being hospitable to the eunuchs and those who are not welcome in the synagogue. I guess I'm wondering, I mean, it seems to suggest that we should use our Sabbath for those who might not come through the door on the Sabbath. It seems like we welcome anyone to come to worship, and we should be hospitable after worship, but we don't usually extend that hospitality outside of those who come into our house.
Yeah, good question.
Like, for an example.
Yeah.
I mean, so you can answer that, but also like extending that to, we have lots of non-Christian friends that, I don't know, maybe have a birthday party on a Sunday that it's part of, it's challenging to figure out what that line should be of wanting to show them that we love them.
Right.
We care for them. And if it, do we do that? Is that breaking the Sabbath, or is that, if it doesn't conflict with worship services, then is it showing our, care for those people?
Yeah, very good. I was actually going to go sort of that second direction of when we get into the Sabbath concrete questions, we start introducing the large gray area where we're between, this breaks the Sabbath clearly, and this keeps the Sabbath clearly, and then so much of our life is in this area in the middle of, well, what are the particularities of the case? What are the details? And we end up creating a very complex pastoral situation. I think within that, sort of framework, we do have principles for, I think the nature of Sabbath rest, going to your first question, would be, in my own personal opinion, a bit more on the passive side than the proactive side. Although it could be, so like you said, receiving visitors, and when they come, invite them over, or engaging with people who come. In the Isaiah 56 passage, for instance, it is an express command to the eunuchs and foreigners to keep the Sabbath. So it's not so much a command to the people of God to seek them out and bring them into the Sabbath, as it is a command to the people of God to welcome them when they come to keep it with you. So the burden is on the other. But even within that, I think I would not want it to be purely passive. So I think of like out in the West and stuff, there's like the bus ministries where they literally just put the name of the church on the bus and they go around to the housing developments and spend time meeting with the kids and getting to know them, and then invite them to church and their families as well, and then give them transportation, because there's no way the carless single mom is going to get to church without it. So there is a proactive Monday through Saturday pursuing of the person in need in order to create a relationship or an infrastructure of service that allows them to then take advantage of a day of rest when that day comes. And of course, on that day, they would still be going to pick them up and everything. So there would still be some function in that way. That's a level of proactivity that I think is very biblical. How far does that go? Like, so do you go and work the soup kitchen on the Sabbath afternoon? You know, now that's clearly farther down the line, and you begin to introduce, you know, more challenges of, well, what does your conscience say? You know? Feeding people on the Sabbath day is definitely something Jesus did. But whether we should institutionalize it in a soup kitchen, that becomes a very difficult question. So I think primarily passive, receive those who come, but also consider building structures and ministries which allow us to produce Sabbath rest as we go forward. Unfortunately, I can't come up with a great illustration for Cambridge. Bus ministry is obviously kind of like, well, most people here can walk.
You were talking about the Sabbath being a hallmark of Christianity, and so much of Christianity has lost the Sabbath. And very strong evangelical Christians that my friends at work say, I can't keep the Sabbath. My kids are in hockey and this and this and this on Sabbath. They don't even, seems like they don't even try hardly. Why has so much of Christianity lost this wonderful blessing? What do you think led to that?
I assume that's a historical question. What do we see in the American experience? On the one hand, we see a loss of that sensibility, that it is a blessing, that it is something to be delighted in and enjoyed. We also see, you ask a guy who's a geek on American history, we see frontierism and the idea that Americans must hack an existence out of wilderness. And that grows into an American culture of, I must conquer creation. And I must conquer other nations. And I must be, the survivor. And there's a real way in which that was expressed in the frontier. But it's also then grown into American, what we would call in the late 20th century, American exceptionalism. And the idea of, I must overcome in order to survive. And that is somewhat antithetical, I think, on its face with dependence to God, on God.
Just would this be a hypothesis? So 2 things come to mind. My parents kept the Lord's explain to me why. It's just something that you did. I think part of it may be that there's a point where you're still doing it, but nobody's teaching you why you're doing it. So you don't understand. So then when the opportunity comes to stop doing it, you're like, well, yeah, I don't really know what to do these things. I guess the other observation would be that culture tends to swing to extremes, and I think there have been times in which Sabbath keeping has been presented in a very oppressive, kind of harsh way.
Yeah.
That tends to make people overreact.
Sit and be silent for hours. I mean, I like silence, but yes.
Well, blue laws went away about 4 years ago here. I mean, I think Massachusetts is one of the last cities, states
States.
to give it up. And that, obviously, the rhythm of work and what you do and what you can't, and that all sort of then, oh, we can do other, I don't know, it's just.
We're humans and we have a calendar. And we will always have a calendar. Whose is it?
But we do have in Massachusetts a law that says you cannot make someone work on the day of rest. But it's there because of the labor unions, not because of
The Christian, yeah.
So there is that protection for workers. Most people don't realize that it's there. But in my job, because I said from the beginning, I'll work really hard any other day, but I just can't work on the Lord's Day. Once you said it once at the beginning, then it's like people, oh yeah, you won't do that.
Well, I mean, God bless the labor unions, preserving the Sabbath. Well, thank you for your patience. If you have more questions and stuff, we can continue. But for now, let's wrap it up here. We've gone over. Sorry about that. Let's sing from Psalm 92. Does anyone know why? Psalm 92? It's a psalm for the Sabbath. And what does the psalm teach us about the Sabbath? It is good to thank the Lord. The subtitle in the Bible is This is a Psalm for the Sabbath. And what we learn about the Sabbath is it's good to spend a day thanking the Lord and recognizing how good He is and how good He's been to us. Before we sing Psalm 92, let me pray for us. Our Father in heaven, thank you for this beautiful day, for a day of rest and of worship. Thank you for the opportunity to delight in you, to wonder at you and what you have done. And our Father, we pray that week by week we would be energized, strengthened, and inspired by the fact that you, as the God of the universe, rested and call us likewise to rest. And we pray, Father, that we would put off our idolatries and our false gods who abuse us and mistreat us and destroy us, and that we would come to you, the one living and true God, who commands rest for His people. Father, we do give you thanks for your goodness to us in this and in all things, and pray that you would bless us in the week ahead as we depart from this day of rest, filled with refreshment and renewal and peace because of your love and grace. These things we give you thanks for and ask in the name of Jesus. Amen.